Hi, today we're sewing two views of my sewing pattern and I will give you a 3/4 sleeve view and I will give you also a short sleeve view, so we cover all the steps that are included in those. Also, please make sure that you have the instruction next to you, since I will keep the arrangement of the steps that I have in the instructions. So I will hop a little bit between those two views, but it is to make sure that you have everything covered in the instructions. So I don't need to do one for each view, but a sew along that will guide you pretty safely through every kind of design that you can do with the pattern pieces. Yeah, have fun sewing! I quickly show you before we start to step into the sewing process the single pieces where I did some interfacing. I will recommend to not skip the interfacing, especially with the V-neck versions, because the V-neck with lightweight fabrics such as silk or viscose fabrics or rayon, you name it, they have the tendency, as you see, to get really stretchy and to lose their shape. So if you want to have precise fitting and sewing results, it's crucial to stabilize the edges at some areas. For the shoulders, some might do this as well. It's not as diagonal that it's necessary, but for the V-neck, for example, at the view B, this is crucial. It's not something that you should skip, because you will have a wonky V-neck, you will have it lower, it will be stretched out, it won't look nice. So please do this. Here for the front pattern piece, I just did it at the diagonal edge for the V. Then I did it for the yoke along the neckline, and the facing, I did a full interfacing because I have such a lightweight fabric. If you have something like a cotton, a linen or a poplin, you might be able to skip this, but for example, also sewing the button blanket with the buttonholes, it's something that I would highly recommend to do, as I also recommended in the instructions. For the view C, it looks a little bit different. If you have a round neck or also the V-neck without a button blanket, you can optionally also interface the full facing. I decided to do so because also this fabric is really slippery and lightweight, so it gives a little bit more structure and makes the sewing easy. Otherwise, just go with a small stripe of 2.5 centimeters along the neckline. Also at the yoke, please. For the V-neck version, where you don't have a button blanket, I would recommend to do the same, to do a full interfacing of the facing piece. I will, same as in the instructions, show the relevant part of the garment when we're doing each single step, so don't be bothered if you don't see the whole garment. Yeah, it will be correlating to what is shown in the instructions, and I think taken from the context, it's clear where we are on our garment. The seam allowance for all seams, if not stated otherwise, is 1.5 centimeters, so it's 5/8 on your sewing machine if you want to take the guidelines that are on the presser plate. Yeah, so let's go. We will start by sewing 2 parallel lines with the basting stitch on your sewing machine. So you turn your stitch length to 5. Make sure that you have a matching needle to your fabric and that it's sharp enough so that you don't tear your fabric or something. And then you will sew in between those 2 dots that you have marked on each shoulder. Just on a short note, I prefer those roller balls with the eraser on top or at the bottom. They are heat erasable, so if you put the iron on them, they will be fully gone, and I think that's really a nice thing to have. On that short note, let's switch to the sewing machine and put those two basting lines. We will now install the facing at the neckline. As you see, I prepared it already with finishing off the edges, the open edge that will be inside the garment and that will be not sewn to the front. It is pretty important that you finish it off with a method of your choice. I went for the serger / overlocker, but you can also use a zigzag. If you go for a zigzag, I would recommend to do it slightly inside the facing piece and then cut off everything that is producing at the seam to make sure that not your seam is pulling your fabric together. This will be something that might be visible when you wear the garment later on. So make sure to have this seam as flat as possible. I've already pinned the facing to the front pieces. As you see, there's a difference between the ones with the button blanket, so it's a two-piece thing. The one that has no button blanket is a one-piece thing, so that's the main difference. What is really important for the button blanket views, which is the round neck or the V-neck, doesn't matter, that when you come to the corner for the round neck is somewhere here, just imagine it, that you will sink the needle into the fabric, lift the presser foot and then move the fabric. So don't just sew it in a straight line because you will get not a nice shaped corner then. By sinking the needle into the fabric, you will make sure that the thread locks, and then when you move it, you will have a really sharp line here. So make sure that you do this. You might also notice when you pin the V-neck to the facing that the facing is slightly shorter. This is also planned. This is correct. This is also something that prevents stretching out the V-neck when wearing and when sewing. So it's something that makes sure that your garment will look nice also after a few wears. For the V-neck and round neck without button blanket, it's a pretty simple thing. You just sew along the neckline. With the V-neck, make sure that you also sink the needle and move the fabric under the presser foot, so that you will have a really nice sharp corner here. After sewing the round neck or the V-neck version without button blanket, it's important that you cut back the seam allowance 1/2 centimeter and then press the facing towards the seam allowance. For the round neck view, you will understitch along the facing so that it won't move towards the front when wearing. And for the V-neck, I don't show every view here, so please make sure to also have a look at the instructions to make sense of what I'm saying now. You will have this V shape here for the V-neck version. Make sure that you really cut straight before the seam into the seam allowance for the V-neck, because otherwise when you try to turn it to the back of your front, it won't be able to do it. So make sure that you don't cut into the seam, but right towards the seam. In the instructions, you will find detailed steps for each neckline, so make sure that you also take a look at them. This is how the understitching looks like when it's finished. So you have the sewing line on the left side on your garment on the facing, and from the inside you have those two parallel lines, and on the outside of your front piece you don't have any seams visible. I will show you the same for the V-neck view. Just to make sure that you really get what I mean by creating a sharp corner. So I will show you the process of sinking in the needle and moving the fabric. If you are new to sewing and you decided to dare this project, this might be something helpful. Otherwise, you just do it and ignore what I'm saying. Yeah. After sewing, it's important to cut back the seam allowance to half a centimeter. Also, with those button blanket versions, no matter if it's the round neck or the V-neck, it doesn't matter. Where you have a corner, it's important that you also cut back right to the corner, to the seam, but not into the seam. This is important because otherwise you will have too much bulk here and you won't get a neat shaped corner when you turn the facing to the back of your front piece. This is what the finished sewn and pressed facing will look like. Make sure that when you press the edge here, where you fold it over, that you have a really equal amount of fabric from the front piece that is pulling towards the facing, so that the facing won't be visible at the front later on when you wear it. For preparing the yoke, you will need to mark the center of your neckline at the yoke pattern pieces, as well as the center of your lower edge. This will later on help you to match your pattern pieces exactly on top of each other later on. Before we start to sew on the yoke, we need to prepare the shoulder area of your front piece by pinning it to the facing. This means that we need to bring the width of your front shoulder to the width of your facing shoulder line. This happens by pulling the threads of your basting stitch, or gathering stitch in this case. If you have never done this, it's pretty simple. You have this parallel lines that you have stitched, and you decide either to pick the two from the under thread or from the top thread, and you pull them, and by pulling them you will create a gather and small folds. You would distribute them evenly and then pin them as I already showed in the example. It's important that you don't gather the first 3 and the last 3 centimeters of your shoulder, because here you will later on have a corner, and the more material you have in the corner when you sew the yoke on, it won't look nice. So try to keep it as flat and thin as possible. And here we have the seam allowance still, we don't need to forget about that. So this means that we also want to have a little bit extra space next to the seam where we don't have gathering so far. So make sure that you keep those 3 centimeters in mind, and then you will just fix it with a basting stitch, or so that it doesn't move before you pin on the yoke. To join together the front pattern, the front piece and the yoke, you will need your outer yoke, the one that you will see when you wear the garment actually, and you pin it to the shoulder. I already prepared it for the other side, so I can show you what you need to take care about. You have this mark on your yoke. This will go right next to your neckline that you have already prepared and already sewn. It's important because this will mark the seam allowance where you will later on have the pattern pieces meet, and where you press them apart, and also where your neckline for your yoke starts. So this needs to be exactly here so that you will have precise results at the end. You pin the yoke right sides facing to the front, so the facing of your neckline is on the back. And after doing so, you will add the second yoke, that will be the lining, so to say, and you will pin it right sides facing to the facing of your front. I will show you in a second when I prepare it. Yeah, just make sure that all your edges are really aligned, and also that the mark is lying on top of each other, and the front and the facing is sandwiched in between the yokes. I prepared the same steps for view C, which is a little bit easier because of my fabric choice to make clear how the pattern pieces are aligned now. So we do have the yoke that will be cut from your outside fabric, and that will be seen later on the back of your body. Then we have the front piece with the gathered shoulder. If we flap the yoke back, and on the back we will have the lining yoke and the facing. And then we will continue by sewing the neckline of your yoke. Before you start to sew the yoke at the neckline together, the two yokes, it's important that you make sure that you have one step exercised pretty precise. At the corners here, at the neckline, when you touch it, you can feel the front pattern piece with the neckline. So you really need to make sure that you move it out of the way, that you don't sew it into the neckline. You grab inside, and you grab the neckline and you pull it towards the shoulders, so that it moves out of the way. You can see here it's a little bulk here, but this makes sure that you don't get it catched when you sew the neckline of your yoke. If you feel that it has the tendency to move back, just use another pin to secure it where it is, so that you don't sew it into the neckline. I will show you on the finished view B what I mean. It's a little bit bulky here because I haven't cut back the seam allowance so far and the corner, but you want both of those pattern pieces. This is the yoke, this is the front piece with the facing. You really want them to align nicely and form a nice neckline. After sewing the neckline, you will grab your shoulder seams and cut them back, so that you have 1/2 centimeter fabric left at the seam allowance, and the same for the neckline. Also make sure that you properly cut back the corners here inside your neckline, because when you fold away the yoke and the front pattern piece, you want to have as less material and fabric inside the seam as possible, so that it lies nice and flat. After turning the inside out and pressing all the seams nicely, it will look something like this. This is the view B, but no matter if it's view B or whatever, make sure that you press your seam at the neckline nicely, same as you did at the front piece, that it pulls the outside fabric slightly towards the facing, or in this case the inside yoke, so that it won't show from the outside, but you have a really nice look of the neckline. In the next step, we want to join the back to the yoke. To be successful, we need to mark the center at the upper edge. So please fold it in half and mark it. Either you clip in to the fabric or you use your pen. And then we want to join it to the outside yoke. After adding the notch or the mark, whatever you prefer, to the center of your upper edge from your back piece, you will sew 2 parallel gathering lines with the basting stitch between those 2 notches to be able to gather the fabric to the same width as the yoke. Pin the back to the outer yoke. Make sure that all your notches are lining up, and there should be only excess fabric between the 2 notches at the center of your back. And please make sure that you pull the gathering stitches and gather the fabric to the same width as the yoke as in this section. Then you need to pin nicely, and you can sew with some basting stitch that it's not moving within the seam allowance. I've prepared the view B to show you how it will look in the end. So we will have the back piece sandwiched in between those 2 yoke pieces. So on the back and on the front it looks the same at the seam. And to achieve this, you will use a method called the burrito method. So I think you get an idea what we will do, because the burrito, it's wrapped. So this is what we do with the fabric. We will wrap it into tight rolls and put it in between the 2 yokes, and then sew this seam, and afterwards we will pull it out again. So I will show you in a second. It's not as difficult as it might sound. So that's how your CLEO top or blouse will look so far. So you have the outer yoke and you have the back piece attached to it by basting stitching. And now we have the challenge to find a way to sew this to this seam from this side without having any fabric in between the seam that you will sew. So it's pretty easy. It's not as challenging as you might expect it. You will turn your garment to the right side upwards, and then you will start to roll the back, and then you will still start to roll the front as well. And now you will already notice, the second yoke is appearing, and you can easily pin it to the previous seam. Make sure all notches align, and there you go. You can just sew along this edge with the usual seam allowance. So this is what it will look like after pinning. You have the 2 yokes right sides facing and the back piece sandwiched in between those 2 yokes. You will sew, as I said, with a normal seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters, and afterwards cut back the seam allowance to 0.5 centimeter, as we did so far with almost every seam. And then there will be the big moment, the reveal. So you will pull both of those rolls out towards one side. So don't do one side and the other one to the other side. That won't work. You have to pull them out on one side, and this way you will turn the fabric to the right side, and then you can press apart the seams, and we will continue with the side seams. Make sure that you don't catch one of the rolls while sewing, and remember to cut back the seam allowance. Also, please pull out all the basting stitches, as we don't need them anymore. After pressing the yoke and the back apart, we will now sew the side seams. This is same procedure as always. We will put the front and the back right sides facing on top of each other, align the sides and sew a seam with 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and finish the open edge off with a method of your choice. If you have a really lightweight fabric and you prefer it and you feel like you're capable of doing it, you can also opt for a French seam. That's why I added a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters to give you this option as well. On the internet you find a lot of very, very detailed and good tutorials on how to do a French seam, so please consult one of those if you want to opt for this. Now you can put aside the top and we will move to sewing the sleeve. I have prepared already one sleeve of each kind. So we will sew the 3/4 length sleeve 1, which is for the design B, for the view B that I am sewing, and we will sew the short version in the wider width. It's the sleeve 2. And we will have this elastic tunnel. Yeah, I haven't put through the elastic yet because it's easier to show how the width differs. That has a normal hem. Yeah, I will guide you through each step. And with those, you should be able to sew every version of a sleeve that is coming up in this sewing pattern. For the longer 3/4 version of the sleeve, you will close the side seams as I showed previously and press the seam back to the back of your sleeve, and then you will sew 2 basting lines for gathering along the lower hemline. And this is because you want to gather the sleeve. You will finish off the hem with this tape and you prepare it by pressing it lengthwise in half and then take it apart, and you will press the open long edges to the center of it and then press again, fold it in half lengthwise. After doing so, you will defold it again and put the short sides on top of each other and sew them together with a seam of allowance of 1 centimeter. After preparing the tape, we need to mark the half of it and each quarter, so we can match it to the sleeve. This means that we have to do the same marks for the sleeve. So we need to do the half sleeve mark and we need the quarters. Now pin the tape to the hem edge. Make sure that the seams match and your tape is unfolded, so you just need one of the open edges. You pin it to the sleeve and then you will match the notches and gather the sleeve to the width of your tape. After distributing the width of the sleeve evenly to the whole tape, make sure that you sew right on the pressing line that you have on your tape. Also make sure that you don't sew in any sleeve. If you have a really fluid fabric, they tend to move under the press of it without noticing, so make sure that you have attention at this. so that you don't need to seam rip, and yeah, sew all the way around the tape. After sewing, you will cut back the loose threads and cut also back the seam allowance for about 3 to 4 millimeters, and then fold over the tape to the wrong side of your sleeve. Also, it's time to remove the basting stitch now, or the gathering stitch, so that you don't sew it into the next seam, which makes it harder to remove. When you fold over the tape to the wrong side of your sleeve, make sure that it overlaps the previous seam for about 1 to 2 millimeters. You will pin from the right side, so when you're sewing, you're not seeing the seam that you have, the edge that you have to catch, but you can feel it right next to the tape that you have already sewn to the sleeve. Make sure that you have this 1 to 2 millimeters overlap and pin, because when you're sewing with a narrow edge stitch from this side that we will do later on when we have pinned all the way around, you will make sure that you also catch the bottom layer. Change to the edge stitch press foot and don't forget to move the needle to the right position. Also, I recommend going slow at seams like this, because you don't want the bottom layer to move, you don't want to seam rip, you just want it smooth and nice. And when you're going slow, you can always use your fingers to make sure that everything is in its place and that it doesn't move. And yeah, let's go. For the short sleeves, you will need this bias tape. It's not a real bias tape, but sort of. It's cut on bias, and you need to press the long open edges 1/2 centimeter to the wrong side of your fabric. So it does not need to be exactly 0.5 centimeters, but make sure that the tape is equal in width all over its length. And this is important because you will stitch it on, and if it's wonky, your stitching line will also be wonky, and this is something that will be seen from the outside later on. Before we pin it to the sleeve, we will need to close the short ends, so you will unfold them, pin them together, and sew with 1 centimeter seam allowance. Attention, 1 centimeter. After pressing apart the seam allowance, you can now pin it to the sleeve. Make sure that you exactly keep the same distance, and when you sew it on with an edge stitch press foot, make sure that you leave a small opening of about 2 centimeters where you can pull through the elastic afterwards. Make sure that you leave a small opening about 2 centimeters where you can pull the elastic into the tunnel. Don't forget about the opening to pull in the elastic. And when we finish sewing on the bias, we can already start to sew the hem by folding in 1/2 centimeter twice, pin, and then sew all the way around the hem. Then your sleeves are ready to be set into the shoulder, and I will show you how to do this in the next step. Also, I will show you the slight difference between sleeve 1 and sleeve 2. Before we set in the sleeve, you can either pull in the elastic now, or you can do it afterwards, depending on what you prefer to sew. As soon as you pull it through into the elastic tool, the sleeve will be a little bit more gathered, so if you don't like that to work with, do it afterwards as the last step. The elastic will be the measurements of your upper arm, and either if you prefer it a little bit more loose, or if you want to have it tight so that you can really create this puffiness in your sleeve, you will add 1 or 2 centimeters to the measurement to get the seam allowance. Make sure that your elastic does not get twisted when pulling it through the tunnel, and when you're done, you will sew together both ends, overlapping with a seam allowance of 0.5 centimeter. Make sure that you also close the opening in the tunnel. You will set in the sleeve 1 by first matching the underarm seam and the side seam, and then you will match all notches, especially the one at the yoke, where the yoke starts. And this is important because if you have a fabric that has the tendency to stretch out, like viscose or silk, those notches make sure that your sleeve is not stretched, but everything is there where it should be. When you reach the top of your shoulder, it's important that you take notice of the difference between the sleeve 1 and sleeve 2. The sleeve 1 is not meant to be gathered in the sense that when you sew it, that you will create folds at the shoulder. There will be a slight pulling at the gathering threads, so make sure that your fabric is distributed evenly, but the pull is only causing that the fabric will create a little bit of round shaping for your shoulder, but there won't be any folds sewn into this fabric. As you can see, after pinning the shoulder section, we do have a little extra, but not as much as when we sew the sleeve 2. After pulling the gathering stitching in a second, you will see that the fabric will lie nice and flat at the area where the seam will be. At the top, at the open edge, there might be a little bit of folds, creating a little bit of wrinkles, but this is something that we do not need to care about because the seam allowance is 1.5 centimeters, so the excess fabric will be cut off. Please make sure that you also have the facing in place, and it needs to align with the shoulder seam, and that you do not by accident sew small folds into the sleeve when sewing in a second. Then you remove the gathering stitches and finish off with a method of your choice. When you start setting in the sleeve, the first step is that you pin together the underarm seams and the side seams so that you will have them really matching and aligning, and make sure that your notches all match. You have the double notch for the back and the single notch for the front, so don't get this mashed up. And yeah, you will pin until you reach the notches for where you start the gathering, and then you pin the shoulder before you start gathering by pulling the threads. After matching all the notches and pinning the sleeve to the Bodice, you would distribute the fabric evenly and pull the threads to gather it. You will add pins and then you can sew all the way round and finish off the edges with a method of your choice. When setting in the sleeve, make sure that you align the edges of the facing and the front piece really neatly. For the views that do not feature a button blanket, the last step is that you will sew the bottom hem. And for this, you would simply roll it 1/2 centimeter towards the wrong side of your fabric, and again 1/2 centimeter. If you have a fabric that tends to fray like mine, make sure that all the threads are either cut off nicely or hidden in the seam, and then you will sew with a edge stitch presser foot and a narrow edge stitch. To hem the view B and D with a button blanket, you will fold over the facing to the right side of your fabric. So the facing and the fabric are right sides facing, and you will fold exactly on top at the pressing line that you have here. Pin on top of each other with the edges aligned, and then you will sew with a seam allowance of 1 centimeter, just the facing. Then you would turn the right side to the outside and form a nice corner. You don't need to clip anything. After hemming your CLEO top or blouse, there's just one step left for the views with a button placket, and it's sewing the buttonholes and the buttons. You have a guideline in the sewing pattern where to place the buttons. For sure you can do individual button placement, but nevertheless you need to make sure that you have them on the same height on both sides. One is for the buttonholes, one is for the buttons. And also you want to make sure that they are all in the same distance to the front edge. So make sure that you make either by basting or, as I did, with a heat erasable or washable or chalk pen, a line where you place the buttons and buttonholes on. When working with really lightweight and delicate fabrics, I'd recommend to use a washable self-adhesive embroidery fleece. I will link it below to make sure that your fabric does not pull together, also that the buttonholes get as beautiful as possible. Afterwards you would just use warm water to dissolve it, and it will be restlessly gone, and the only thing that remains are your buttonholes. For opening a buttonhole the safe way, there is a nice trick. You just need a pin and a seam ripper. So you place the pin at the top of your buttonhole, right below the horizontal small stitching. Then you enter with a seam ripper at the opposite end, and you can cut all the way up to the needle, open the buttonhole, and you have a really nice clean cut. You could sew the buttons to your garment either by hand or with a machine if you prefer sewing with a machine but you don't have a buttonhole foot or a specific setting for this. I do have an easy trick for you. You just need a little piece of Scotch tape, place the button on it with the top side glued to the Scotch tape, then you place it on the mark and you will use a zigzag with the stitch length put to 0 so it won't move up and down. But with a hand wheel you will also adjust the stitch width so that it will always meet the holes, and then you can slowly stitch this button to the fabric and you will have a really nice finish. Afterwards you will remove the Scotch tape and pull the threads to the back of your button blanket and knot them there. Yeah, that's it. You're done with your CLEO and I hope you really love wearing it.